Two sisters, two queens. At first glance, the daughters of Henry VIII could not be more different. The relationship between Elizabeth and Mary is a very difficult one to understand, filled with complexity and contradiction. There's an enormous age gap for one thing. Mary was born in 1516, while Elizabeth wouldn't arrive until 1533, making Mary 17 years older than her half-sister. Mary's childhood was steeped in the Catholic Church, shaped by her devout mother Catherine of Aragon. Everything about her life was about religion. Her daily routine included multiple prayer sessions, attendance at Mass, and strict adherence to Catholic traditions and holidays. Elizabeth had a Protestant upbringing, influenced by her mother Anne Boleyn's reformist leanings and later by the Protestant tutors who guided her education. To Mary, Elizabeth probably seemed somewhat old-fashioned, representing a threat to the true faith Mary held so dear. The sisters stood diametrically opposed to each other on issues of religion, creating a fundamental divide that would shape their relationship and their respective reigns. Tudor society at the time of their rule was ill-equipped to accept a female sovereign, making both women's paths to power extraordinarily challenging. England was a patriarchal society where women were believed to be ruled by their emotions rather than reason. They were very much considered the weaker sex, thought incapable of making difficult decisions or commanding the respect necessary to rule effectively. It was widely believed that women were incapable of ruling as effectively as men, a prejudice both sisters would have to overcome. One's reign was short, the other's long. Mary ruled for just 5 years, while Elizabeth's reign stretched to 45. One was Catholic, the other Protestant, a division that would define the religious landscape of England for generations. One was allied to Spain, the other's greatest triumph came in defying them. Mary through her marriage to Philip II, Elizabeth through the defeat of the Spanish Armada. There's no doubt that Elizabeth gets to learn from Mary's mistakes and borrow from her example, giving the younger sister a blueprint of what to avoid in her own reign. Elizabeth's decision not to marry is a pragmatic and calculated decision, not merely a romantic choice to remain the Virgin Queen. For she had seen how wrong it could go with Mary, whose marriage to Philip of Spain had proven deeply unpopular with the English people. Elizabeth emerged as the kind of queen of spin before spin was invented, masterfully crafting her image and legacy. One of the things she was so successful at is erasing Mary's legacy, pushing her half-sister into the shadows of history. Many people forget the fact that actually Mary was the first crowned Queen of England in her own right, a pioneer despite her troubled reign. One was reviled as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, the other was celebrated as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who ushered in a golden age. But more unites these half-sisters than many realize. Both faced the extraordinary challenge of ruling as women in a man's world. Mary was born in Greenwich on the 18th of February 1516, arriving to great celebration despite not being the male heir her father desperately wanted. Her mother was Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess of impeccable royal lineage. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, giving Mary powerful connections throughout Europe from birth. She was a Spanish lady of great dignity and piety, deeply steeped in the Catholicism of Spain. Catherine of Aragon had come from a family of very impressive women, rulers and warriors in their own right. Catherine of Aragon's mother Isabella of Castile was a real warrior figure, a queen who had united Spain through her marriage and military campaigns. She educated Catherine of Aragon and her children essentially on the battlefield, bringing them along during military campaigns. Isabella was very keen on educating all her children, male and female, believing that royal daughters needed to be as prepared to rule as sons. Catherine of Aragon was one of the most educated, accomplished women in Europe, fluent in multiple languages and well-versed in theology, literature, and statecraft. Although not the hoped-for son, Mary was a relief to her parents who had faced years of reproductive disappointment. They had been married almost 7 years, but a series of miscarriages and stillbirths had denied them heirs, making Mary's healthy birth a cause for celebration. Mary was proof they could have children, offering hope for the future of the Tudor dynasty. With Catherine only just 30 and Henry even younger at the time of Mary's birth, there was still hope that a younger brother would one day join Mary and secure the succession. As a child, Mary was fair and ruddy-cheeked. bearing a strong resemblance to her father in her early years. Henry loved children and doted on his daughter, proudly showing her off to foreign ambassadors and court visitors. She had the finest education a girl could expect at this time, learning languages, music, dancing, and religious instruction. Mary, as far as Henry was concerned, should be brought up to be a good wife, preparing her for her future role as a royal consort to some European prince. But actually, Mary's mother Catherine of Aragon didn't want to settle for that limited destiny for her only surviving child. She was brought up very largely by her mother to be a Spanish-speaking, Spanish-believing Spanish Catholic, creating a cultural identity that was as much Spanish as English. She's surrounded by an army of attendants from her earliest days. Treated with all the ceremony due to the heir to the throne, the best tutors were employed to ensure she could fulfill her royal duties, whether as queen or princess. She's brought up to be able to dance, to sing, to play multiple instruments, all the accomplishments expected of a Renaissance princess. She's extraordinarily accomplished even by a very young age, impressing foreign visitors with her poise and learning. It's not really until 1525, when Mary is sent to Ludlow Castle as the de facto Princess of Wales, that her education takes a more serious turn. In rural Wales, effectively serving as her father's representative, she gets a proper formal education in things like Latin and Greek and strategy, the things you need to be a monarch. Mary's education stood her in excellent stead for her future challenges, preparing her intellectually if not emotionally for the trials ahead. She believed that she was just as intelligent as any man, a radical notion in Tudor England. She believed that she had the abilities and the intellect of her father, combined with the reflection, consideration, and religious knowledge of her mother. Above all, her education was preparation for her future as a royal bride, the currency through which international alliances were forged. A princess was a valuable commodity in 16th century Europe, to be traded and negotiated over for maximum political advantage. Arranged marriages could make or break treaties and alliances, cementing friendships between nations or healing old wounds. They could change the course of history, redirecting the flow of power, wealth, and influence across the continent. If you were a king in the 16th century and you had children, they had two primary functions in service to the state. If you had a son, his function was to succeed you and be a strong male ruler, ensuring the continuity of your dynasty. If you had a daughter, her purpose was to make a strategic marriage that would benefit your kingdom through alliance and connection. Mary Tudor's value as a diplomatic pawn was established early in her life, with her father using her as a bargaining chip in European politics. She was betrothed multiple times to various foreign princes, some arrangements made when she was barely 2 years old. These betrothals weren't necessarily meant to be permanent, but rather served as symbols of alliance between England and continental powers. Mary became a crucial piece on the chessboard of European diplomacy, her hand in marriage offered and withdrawn as Henry VI's political needs shifted. The young princess understood her role was primarily to cement political alliances through marriage, a common fate for royal daughters throughout history. Mary's secure position as Henry's beloved daughter began to crumble when her mother Catherine of Aragon reached her 40th birthday in 1525. This milestone only confirmed what had become increasingly apparent: Catherine would never provide Henry with the male heir he desperately craved. Henry's obsession with having a son wasn't merely personal vanity, but stemmed from genuine dynastic concerns. The Tudor claim to the throne was relatively recent and somewhat tenuous, with Henry being only the second Tudor monarch. England was surrounded by potential enemies: hostile Scotland to the north, rebellious Wales and Ireland, and continental powers like France and Spain all posed threats to Tudor rule. Without a male heir, Henry feared England would descend into civil war after his death, undoing everything his father had built. This dynastic anxiety consumed Henry, gradually overshadowing his once loving relationship with both Catherine and Mary. As Catherine's childbearing years ended, Henry's eye wandered to Anne Boleyn, a lady in waiting to the Queen. Unlike his previous mistresses, Anne refused to become merely another royal conquest, insisting on marriage and the crown. Henry's infatuation with Anne became all-consuming, convincing himself she would provide the son Catherine could not. To marry Anne, Henry needed to end his marriage to Catherine, a process that would tear the royal family apart and reshape England's religious landscape forever. Henry seized upon a verse in Leviticus suggesting that marrying his brother's widows. Catherine had briefly been married to Henry's brother Arthur before his death was sinful. He argued this biblical prohibition had cursed their union, preventing the birth of healthy male heirs. The king demanded an annulment from Pope Clement VI, claiming his marriage to Catherine had never been valid. Catherine, steadfast in her Catholic faith and convinced of her rightful position as queen, refused to cooperate with Henry's schemes. The papal decision dragged on for years, frustrating Henry and emboldening Anne Boleyn's faction at court. Mary, now an adolescent, found herself caught between her warring parents, her loyalty torn between her father the king and her devoted mother. In a cruel attempt to break Catherine's resistance, Henry banned mother and daughter from seeing each other in May 1531. The king decreed they could only meet if both declared support for the annulment, an impossible condition for the devoutly Catholic women. This separation devastated Mary, who was already suffering from frequent illnesses and bouts of melancholy. The psychological impact on the teenage princess was profound. Her father was not only divorcing her mother, but threatening to declare Mary illegitimate and remove her from the succession. These traumatic events during Mary's formative years shaped her character and worldview, instilling a rigid adherence to Catholicism and a deep-seated insecurity about her status. For both Catherine and Mary, Henry's eventual solution was particularly shocking. He broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and had his own clergy grant the annulment the Pope had denied. This religious revolution was driven not by theological conviction, but by Henry's determination to marry Anne Boleyn and secure a male heir. When Henry married Anne in January 1533, Mary's position at court deteriorated dramatically. The 16-year-old princess was stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, and forced to serve in the household of her infant half, Sister Elizabeth, born in September 1533. This humiliation was compounded by Anne Boleyn's hostility toward Mary, whom she viewed as a threat to her own daughter's position. Mary's refusal to acknowledge Anne as queen or Elizabeth as legitimate further inflamed tensions within the fractured royal family. Catherine of Aragon died in January 1536, leaving Mary without her strongest ally and support. Within months, Anne Boleyn fell from favor when she too failed to produce a male heir and was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave him his longed-for son, Edward, in October 1537, though she died shortly after childbirth. The birth of Edward pushed Mary further from the throne, but Jane had encouraged reconciliation between Henry and his daughters during her brief reign. Under pressure, Mary eventually submitted to her father's religious authority, though she maintained her private Catholic devotions. The remaining years of Henry's reign saw Mary's status partially restored, though she remained legally illegitimate. When Henry died in 1547, 9-year-old Edward became king, and England moved toward a more radical Protestantism under his regents. Mary, now in her 30s, faced increasing pressure to conform to the new religious settlement, which she steadfastly resisted. Edward's early death in 1553 led to a succession crisis when he attempted to exclude his Catholic half-sister from the throne in favor of the Protestant Lady Jane Grey. Mary rallied support among the nobility and common people, many of whom respected her legitimacy despite religious differences. Her successful claim to the throne marked a remarkable reversal of fortune for a woman who had endured decades of uncertainty and humiliation. Mary's triumphant entry into London, with Elizabeth riding beside her, seemed to herald a new era of Tudor sisterhood, though the harmony would prove short-lived as religious differences and questions of succession continued to divide them. Mary Tudor's accession to the English throne in 1553 marked a dramatic turning point in the nation's religious landscape. After years of Protestant reforms under Edward VI, Mary was determined to return England to the Catholic fold. Her coronation in October 1553 was a lavish Catholic ceremony, deliberately designed to signal the religious direction of her reign. Within months of taking power, Mary had Parliament repeal the Protestant religious legislation of her brother's reign, restoring the Latin Mass and Catholic practices across the kingdom. Mary's religious zeal was deeply personal, rooted in her unwavering devotion to the faith of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. For Mary, Restoring Catholicism was not merely a political act but a sacred duty to heal what she saw as a profound spiritual wound in her kingdom. The Queen's religious policies initially met with cautious acceptance, as many English people had maintained Catholic sympathies despite the official changes of the previous decades. Mary's decision to marry Philip of Spain, however, proved far more controversial than her religious reforms. The Spanish match, announced in early 1554, provoked immediate opposition from many of her subjects who feared England would become a satellite of the powerful Habsburg Empire. Thomas Wyatt the Younger led a rebellion against the Spanish marriage in January 1554, gathering thousands of supporters in Kent before marching on London. Though Wyatt's forces were ultimately defeated, the rebellion revealed the fragility of Mary's position and cast a shadow of suspicion over her half-sister Elizabeth. Despite having no evidence of Elizabeth's involvement in the plot, Mary had her imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where their mother Anne Boleyn had met her end. Elizabeth, displaying the political acumen that would later define her reign, carefully navigated this dangerous period, proclaiming her innocence and loyalty to her sister. After 2 months in the Tower, Elizabeth was released to house arrest at Woodstock, where she remained under close watch for nearly a year. Mary's marriage to Philip proceeded in July 1554, but the union would bring her little happiness and no children. By late 1554, Mary believed herself pregnant, announcing the joyful news to her court and the nation. Preparations were made for the birth of an heir who would secure the Catholic succession. But as months passed, no child appeared. What Mary experienced was likely a phantom pregnancy, possibly caused by her desperate desire for a child combined with physical symptoms of what may have been an ovarian cyst or uterine tumor. The absence of a child deepened Mary's determination to secure her religious legacy through other means. In 1555, the burning of Protestant heretics began in earnest, earning Mary the posthumous nickname Bloody Mary. Nearly 300 religious dissenters were executed during her reign, including prominent Protestant bishops like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had annulled her mother's marriage. These public executions, far from strengthening Catholicism, created martyrs whose suffering was recorded in works like John Fox's Book of Martyrs, which would shape Protestant identity for generations. As Mary's health declined in 1558, the question of succession loomed large. Despite pressure from Catholic advisors to exclude her Protestant half-sister from the throne, Mary ultimately accepted Elizabeth as her heir. On November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor died at St. James's Palace, bringing her 5-year reign to a close. Elizabeth Tudor received news of her sister's death while sitting under an oak tree at Hatfield House. Her reported first words upon learning she was queen, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes," reflected both her Protestant faith and her sense that her survival and succession were providential. Elizabeth's coronation in January 1559 marked the beginning of a reign that would last 45 years and come to be celebrated as a golden age in English history. Where Mary had been dogmatic in her religious policies, Elizabeth sought a middle way through the religious settlement of 1559, establishing a moderately Protestant Church of England that retained certain Catholic elements in its structure and ceremony. Elizabeth's pragmatic approach to religion reflected her political wisdom. She famously declared she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, focusing on outward conformity rather than inner belief. The contrasts between the Tudor sisters extended beyond religion to their approaches to marriage and rule. Where Mary had married a foreign prince and shared her power, Elizabeth remained unmarried, famously declaring herself wedded to England and maintaining sole authority. Elizabeth learned from Mary's mistakes, avoiding foreign entanglements that might compromise English sovereignty and cultivating a powerful image as the Virgin Queen. Despite their differences and the tensions that marked their relationship, the reigns of Mary and Elizabeth Tudor collectively established that women could rule effectively in their own right. These sister queens, though divided by faith and circumstance, both demonstrated remarkable courage in navigating a world dominated by male power. Their pioneering reigns set important precedents for future queens, from Mary Seveley and Anne to Victoria and Elizabeth Sue, creating a legacy of female leadership that would endure for centuries in British history. In the end, it was Elizabeth who fulfilled the promise of Tudor greatness that had eluded her sister. But both women played crucial roles in shaping the monarchy and nation that would emerge from the tumultuous 16th century. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 ushered in a new era for the Tudor dynasty, with 9-year-old Edward VI ascending to the throne as England's first undisputed child monarch in almost 150 years. Despite his youth, Edward was no mere figurehead in the political landscape of Tudor England. Described as a lusty child and well-fed, contemporary accounts paint a picture of a robust young king, whose early portraits show a thriving boy with a healthy constitution. Far from the sickly child sometimes portrayed in popular culture, Edward excelled physically, demonstrating prowess as both a horseman and athlete, even aspiring to follow in his father's footsteps by competing in tournaments. Edward's intellectual capabilities matched his physical ones, having received an exceptional humanist education from some of the finest scholars in Europe, including the renowned Roger Ascham. While regents officially governed during his minority, first his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, followed by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Historians now recognize that the young king was increasingly assertive in matters of state as he matured. Perhaps most significantly, Edward VI embraced Protestantism with remarkable zeal, pushing religious reforms far beyond what his father had envisioned. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced during his reign, fundamentally transformed religious practice in England, replacing Latin with English in church services and establishing a distinctly Protestant liturgy that would influence Anglican worship for centuries. Edward's religious convictions created immediate tensions with his half-sister Mary, who remained steadfastly Catholic despite the changing theological landscape of Tudor England. Mary's refusal to attend Protestant services or abandon her Catholic Mass put her in direct conflict with Edward's government, creating a constitutional crisis that threatened to escalate into something more dangerous. The young king, despite familial bonds, showed little tolerance for Mary's religious defiance, writing in his journal, "The Lady Mary, my sister, was spoken to come to the new service, but she refuses." For Mary, who had already suffered the trauma of being declared illegitimate and forced to renounce her mother's marriage, this period represented yet another painful chapter where her conscience and identity were under assault. Elizabeth, by contrast, navigated the religious waters with characteristic pragmatism, outwardly conforming to Protestant practices while keeping her personal theological convictions carefully guarded. The personal lives of both princesses during Edward's reign were marked by danger and intrigue, particularly for the teenage Elizabeth. Placed in the household of Catherine Parr, Henry VI's sixth and surviving wife, Elizabeth initially found a supportive environment for her intellectual development. However, after Parr's marriage to the ambitious Thomas Seymour, Lord High Admiral and brother to the Lord Protector, Elizabeth's situation grew precarious. Historical evidence strongly suggests that Seymour, who had once sought Elizabeth's hand in marriage before wedding her stepmother, subjected the 14-year-old princess to inappropriate behavior that modern historians characterize as sexual harassment or abuse. Catherine Parr would discover her husband entering Elizabeth's bedchamber in the mornings, sometimes partially dressed, where he would engage in romping behavior that included tickling and slapping the young princess. The scandal eventually forced Elizabeth's removal from the household, but the damage to her reputation lingered, creating whispers that would follow her for years. Mary, meanwhile, maintained her own household away from court, increasingly isolated by her religious stance but unwavering in her convictions. By early 1553, it became apparent that Edward's health was failing, likely from tuberculosis or a similar pulmonary condition. As the young king's condition deteriorated, the Duke of Northumberland orchestrated a dramatic attempt to alter the succession, convincing Edward to exclude both his half-sisters from the throne. The device for the succession, as it came to be known, bypassed Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law and Henry VI's grandniece. Edward, concerned that Mary would reverse his religious reforms and return England to Catholicism, agreed to the plan, though historians debate whether he was manipulated or acted from genuine religious conviction. The dying king's decision set the stage for one of the most dramatic succession crises in English history, one that would ultimately determine whether Mary or Elizabeth would ever wear the crown. When Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15, the Tudor siblings stood at a crossroads. Mary, now 37, received word of her brother's death while staying at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, immediately declaring herself queen despite the proclamation of Lady Jane Grey in London. Elizabeth, 19 and politically astute beyond her years, chose a careful path of watchful waiting as the succession crisis unfolded. The death of their brother had transformed the Tudor sisters from marginalized princesses to central figures in a high-stakes political drama that would determine not only their personal fates, but the religious and political future of England itself. Mary Tudor's relationship with her brother Edward had always been strained, particularly over matters of faith. While Edward embraced the new Protestant religion with the zeal of youth, Mary stubbornly clung to her Catholic faith. Her household maintained the traditions of the old religion, creating constant friction between the royal siblings. Throughout Edward's reign, Mary found herself at loggerheads with the council over her right to have Catholic Mass said in her household. Edward, despite his youth, asserted his royal authority, declaring, "You will submit to me, I am king." Tessa Mary, 19 years his senior, refused to yield, responding, "You're my little brother. I'm certainly not going to take orders from you." Their disagreements were not quiet family disputes but full-blown confrontations that sometimes played out in public. Mary was not a person who shied away from conflict when it came to matters of principle. One particularly memorable Christmas, the royal siblings had a stand-up row in front of the entire court that ended with both of them bursting into tears over their religious differences. Mary believed her brother was wrong in abandoning the Catholic faith, while Edward was equally convinced that the Catholic Mass was a heresy. Between their opposing religious convictions, there was simply no common ground to be found. The religious tensions that defined their relationship would soon be rendered moot by tragedy. Early in 1553, Edward fell gravely ill, his young body ravaged by what historians now believe was tuberculosis. On the 6th of July that year, the 15-year-old king died, leaving a dangerous power vacuum in his wake. The king's death was kept secret by his government for several days as they executed a carefully crafted plan to secure the Protestant succession. Edward had been acutely aware that Mary was waiting in the wings, ready to restore Catholicism and undo all the religious reforms of his reign. With death approaching and time running short, Edward didn't have the luxury of going through Parliament to alter the succession. In April, just months before his death, he wrote the Device for the Succession, a document that excluded both of his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from inheriting the throne. Instead, he named his first cousin, once removed, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. Lady Jane happened to be married to the son of Edward's Lord Protector, the powerful Duke of Northumberland, creating a convenient political alliance. She was a girl that few in England had heard of, but Edward believed her succession would ensure England remained Protestant forever and ever. The Lady Jane Grey accession was, at its heart, a Protestant coup d'état. When word of the king's death finally spread beyond the palace walls, Mary Tudor was already preparing to fight for what she saw as her birthright. From her vast estates in East Anglia, she began raising an army, pushing England to the brink of civil war. In the summer of 1553, England faced its first succession crisis since the Wars of the Roses. About 3 days before Edward's death was announced, Mary had been riding toward court, believing her brother's health had improved and she had been invited to visit. What she didn't know was that a trap had been laid. She was to be seized and imprisoned to prevent her from challenging Lady Jane's succession. The conspirators had fundamentally underestimated Mary's caution and the loyalty of her supporters. She had gotten as far as Hertfordshire when she received a tip off from a supporter at court warning her, "Do not come. There is a plan to capture you." This timely warning was perhaps the first stroke of good fortune in a life that had seen little of it. One of her loyal supporters rode through the night to reach her with news that would change everything. Edward was dead, and by right of birth, she was now Queen of England. Without hesitation, Mary turned around and rode with her retainers into East Anglia, where she began to muster troops from among her tenants and supporters. East Anglia was an area where Mary held extensive estates, giving her access to considerable local support. For Mary, This moment represented divine providence. God had protected her through all the trials of her life, so she could take her rightful place on the throne and restore England to the Catholic faith. This was her divine mission, and she approached it with the characteristic Tudor determination. Mary was prepared to fight for her throne if necessary, embodying the stubborn attitude that had become a hallmark of the Tudor dynasty. On July 10th, Edward's council, led by the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, formally declared Lady Jane Grey Queen of England. On paper, the council held all the advantages. They controlled London, the Tower, and the royal armory. Northumberland immediately set about raising forces to apprehend both Mary and Elizabeth, seeing the Tudor sisters as the greatest threats to his plans. However, the moment Northumberland left London to pursue Mary, cracks began to appear in what had seemed a solid conspiracy. Council members started questioning whether supporting Lady Jane was truly wise. When Jane was proclaimed queen in London, there was a stony silence throughout the city, an eerie experience with no cheering crowds to welcome the new monarch. The people of England knew who their rightful queen was, and it wasn't Lady Jane Grey. Mary Tudor had triumphed against overwhelming odds to claim her rightful throne. The people of England had recognized her legitimacy as Henry V's daughter, rejecting the puppet queen Jane Grey, who had been installed through manipulation and political maneuvering. Mary's victory was remarkably bloodless, a testament to the widespread support she commanded throughout the realm, despite years of mistreatment and exclusion. As Mary prepared to enter London as queen, her younger half-sister Elizabeth faced a critical decision about her own position in this new regime. Elizabeth, ever the shrewd political operator, chose to visibly align herself with Mary's cause, riding out to meet her sister with an impressive entourage of 1,000 horsemen dressed in her signature colors of green and white. This calculated display served dual purposes, showing support for the new queen while simultaneously reminding everyone of Elizabeth's own royal status and considerable following. The sisters' entry into London became a magnificent spectacle that the city had eagerly prepared for, with streets swept clean and buildings adorned with elaborate tapestries. Mary presented herself in full royal regalia, draped in purple, the color of royalty, and adorned with jewels and pearls that proclaimed her sovereign status in the most visible way possible. Though Mary lacked natural charisma, being somewhat shy and awkward in public settings, the occasion transcended her personal limitations. Behind her rode Elizabeth, tall and striking with an ethereal beauty that was already becoming legendary, creating a powerful image of Tudor solidarity and dynastic continuity. Both women understood the symbolic importance of presenting themselves as daughters of Henry V, legitimate heirs to the Tudor legacy that flowed through their veins despite their different mothers. Yet beneath this carefully choreographed display of sisterly unity lay complex undercurrents of political calculation. Elizabeth, while genuinely relieved at avoiding the dangers of a disputed succession, was fundamentally a political creature focused on securing her own position and protecting her interests. Supporting Mary openly was the most prudent course, but Elizabeth ensured her own presence made an impression. She was visibly positioning herself as second in line to the throne. Mary's coronation on October 1st marked a decisive turning point in English religious policy. The ceremony itself was conducted as a traditional Catholic service, signaling Mary's determination to reverse the Protestant reforms instituted under her father and brother. From the very beginning of her reign, Mary made it abundantly clear that she viewed England's Protestant period as a temporary aberration to be corrected, rather than a permanent change to be respected. When Mary ascended the throne, Catholic Mass remained technically illegal under English law, a situation she found intolerable given her deep personal devotion. Over the subsequent months and years, she would work diligently, if sometimes cautiously, to reintroduce Catholic practices and institutions throughout the realm. The restoration of Catholicism became Mary's defining mission, the central preoccupation that would shape every aspect of her reign, from domestic policy to foreign relations. In Mary's vision, England would return to the faith of her youth, the religion her mother Catherine of Aragon had instilled in her through years of devoted practice and instruction. This religious restoration became more than policy, it was personal vindication, a way of honoring her mother's memory and rejecting the changes that had accompanied Catherine's humiliation and Mary's own disinheritance. Mary's government made it clear that England was once again a Catholic country, and religious conformity would be expected of all subjects regardless of their personal convictions. Those who refused to comply with the restored Catholic practices would face consequences, a policy that would eventually earn Mary her notorious historical nickname. Yet Mary understood that for her Catholic restoration to endure beyond her lifetime, she needed to secure the succession with a child of her own faith. This necessity led to what would become one of the most controversial decisions of her reign, her choice of husband. After considering various candidates, Mary settled on Prince Philip of Spain, heir to the vast Habsburg Empire that controlled territories across Europe and the New World. This decision alarmed many of her advisors and subjects, who feared England would become merely a satellite of Spanish power, losing its independence to foreign control. The marriage took place on July 25, 1554, just 2 days after the couple's first meeting, a reminder that royal marriages were political alliances first and personal relationships second. Mary's matrimonial choice reflected both practical and emotional considerations. She faced the classic dilemma of queenly marriage. Selecting an English nobleman would elevate one family above others, creating dangerous jealousies among the aristocracy. Yet choosing a foreign prince risked subordinating English interests to those of another nation, a prospect that naturally alarmed her subjects. Mary felt a particular debt of gratitude to Spain, which had supported her claim to the throne during her darkest hours of exclusion and danger. More fundamentally, she hoped this marriage would allow her to establish a Catholic dynasty that would continue her religious mission beyond her own lifetime. In this, Mary sought to emulate her beloved mother Catherine, creating a legacy that would vindicate the Spanish princess who had suffered so much for her faith and principles. Mary Tudor had long dreamed of restoring England to Catholicism, and in her mind, a Spanish marriage would cement this vision. By marrying Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, Mary sought to recreate the dynastic alliance her parents had formed decades earlier. In many ways, this match made perfect sense. Spain was Europe's preeminent Catholic power, and Philip represented a strong dynastic partner who could help secure Mary's religious reforms. The marriage treaty itself was carefully crafted to protect English interests. What we might consider a prenuptial agreement today established clear limitations on Philip's authority in England. He would have no power to make governmental appointments, could not introduce Spanish customs or language into English administration, could not remove Mary from England against her will, and could not automatically draw England into Spain's ongoing European conflicts. Despite these safeguards, the English people and nobility harbored deep suspicions about the Spanish match. Many feared that regardless of any treaty provisions, a foreign Catholic prince would inevitably dominate the Queen and subjugate England to Spanish interests. This fear ran deep in the English psyche, the horror of becoming a mere satellite to the vast Spanish Empire with its connections to the Holy Roman Empire, struck at the heart of emerging English national identity. Mary, however, never fully grasped how profoundly her subjects objected to foreign influence in English affairs. Her romantic and religious devotion to the match blinded her to the political reality she faced. For Mary, this marriage represented not just personal happiness, but the fulfillment of her sacred mission to restore England to the Catholic fold. The announcement of Mary's Spanish marriage sparked immediate resistance, culminating in what became known as Wyatt's Rebellion. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant gentleman from Kent, organized a coordinated uprising aimed at deposing Mary and placing Elizabeth on the throne. Wyatt managed to gather between 2,000 and 3,000 armed supporters willing to fight for the Protestant cause and Elizabeth's succession. However, the broader rebellion failed to materialize as planned. Other regional uprisings collapsed before they began, leaving Wyatt's forces to march alone toward London. When they reached the capital, they found the city's defenses prepared and loyal to the Queen. After brief fighting, royal forces repelled and defeated the rebels. Mary's government responded with swift and public retribution. The rebellion's leaders were executed in highly visible ceremonies designed to demonstrate the Queen's power and resolve. These public executions sent a clear message about the consequences of challenging Mary's authority or her religious mission. While the rebellion itself posed only a temporary threat to Mary's rule, its aftermath created a far more dangerous situation for Princess Elizabeth. Many at court suspected Elizabeth's involvement in the plot, placing her in mortal danger. The historical record remains unclear about exactly how much Elizabeth knew beforehand. Evidence suggests that rebels had approached several people in her circle, and it seems plausible that she received some information about their plans. Whether she actively encouraged them remains unknown, but many believed she was at least aware of the conspiracy. Elizabeth found herself in an extraordinarily precarious position. As the champion of her father's reformed religion, she naturally became the figurehead around whom Protestant resistance gathered. Yet any hint of disloyalty to her sister the Queen could cost her life. Elizabeth had to navigate this dangerous landscape with extreme caution. When questioned repeatedly by Mary's Privy Council, Elizabeth vehemently proclaimed her innocence and loyalty to the Queen. Despite her protestations, Mary ordered Elizabeth imprisoned in the Tower of London, ominously, in the same apartments where her mother Anne Boleyn had awaited execution years before. The parallel was lost on no one, least of all Elizabeth herself. She understood that her life hung by the thinnest of threads. Indeed, Mary's advisors prepared a warrant for Elizabeth's execution, and contemporary accounts suggest Mary nearly signed it. With the pen hovering above the document, Mary apparently experienced a crisis of conscience and could not bring herself to order her sister's death. Perhaps Mary was moved by the desperate letter Elizabeth sent pleading for mercy. Or perhaps Mary recognized that executing her sister would only deepen the religious divisions tearing at England's fabric. Whatever her reasoning, Mary ultimately chose imprisonment rather than execution. After several tense months in the Tower, Elizabeth was released, though she remained under close surveillance. With the rebellion crushed and Elizabeth neutralized, Mary turned her full attention to her religious mission. By late 1554, England had been formally reconciled with Rome. Catholic doctrine and practices returned to English churches. Religious orders were re-established throughout the country, and the heresy laws were reinstated, providing legal mechanisms for the prosecution of Protestants. These heresy laws led to Mary's most controversial legacy, the burning of Protestant heretics, that earned her the posthumous nickname Bloody Mary. During her 5-year reign, hundreds of Protestants were condemned to death by burning at the stake for refusing to renounce their faith. While religious persecution was not unusual in 16th century Europe, the concentrated nature of Mary's campaign stood out. The burnings occurred in a relatively compressed time frame and with a particular intensity that shocked contemporaries. Mary believed these executions were necessary to purge heresy from England and save souls from eternal damnation. In her mind, these were acts of spiritual mercy, not cruelty. Yet the public spectacle of these executions, with victims suffering agonizing deaths while proclaiming their Protestant faith, ultimately undermined Mary's cause rather than strengthening it. Each martyr created new sympathy for the Protestant cause, and accounts of their suffering spread through pamphlets and word of mouth. What Mary intended as a demonstration of Catholic authority instead became powerful propaganda against her religious program. Mary's reign, which had begun with such promise and popular support, was now entering its darkest phase. The burning of heretics became the defining feature of her rule, with a scale that shocked even some of her supporters. Over her 5-year reign, 287 men, women, and children were burned at the stake for their Protestant beliefs, a number far exceeding what Mary had initially anticipated. She had genuinely believed that executing a small number of prominent heretics would be sufficient to deter others and bring the country back to the Catholic fold. In the religious framework of 16th century Europe, Mary's actions weren't viewed as bloodthirsty, but as a solemn responsibility. There existed a widespread belief that allowing heretics to live would endanger one's own soul, that tolerating heresy made one complicit in it. As queen and defender of the faith, Mary felt a profound duty to cleanse England of what she saw as a spiritual contagion. Her counselors and bishops reinforced this view, arguing that these executions were necessary for the salvation of the realm. In late 1554, a ray of hope emerged for Mary's Catholic vision when she announced her pregnancy. The news seemed to confirm divine blessing on her marriage and religious policies. For Mary, This child represented everything she had fought for: the continuation of her Catholic restoration and the Tudor Habsburg dynasty. With characteristic confidence in God's plan, she summoned Elizabeth to court for the anticipated birth. Mary wanted her Protestant half-sister to witness firsthand the arrival of the child who would displace Elizabeth in the succession and secure England's Catholic future. For Elizabeth and her Protestant supporters, this was a moment of profound anxiety and despair. If Mary produced a healthy heir, Elizabeth's chances of ever taking the throne would vanish, and with them, the hopes of England's Protestants. The entire court waited in anticipation as Mary entered confinement, the traditional period of seclusion before royal births. Preparations were made, announcements drafted, and celebrations planned. Europe's royal houses watched with keen interest as the due date approached. But the weeks passed and no child arrived. Mary remained secluded, insisting that the birth was merely delayed. Eventually, the terrible truth became unavoidable: there was no baby. What Mary had experienced was a phantom pregnancy, likely caused by her desperate desire for a child combined with symptoms of what modern physicians believe may have been ovarian cancer. The swelling that had been taken as proof of pregnancy was actually a manifestation of her illness. After months of anticipation, Mary had to emerge from her chambers and face the humiliation of admitting her mistake. For a queen who had staked so much on this pregnancy, the psychological blow was devastating. Elizabeth, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly back in position as heir presumptive. Mary's phantom pregnancy marked a turning point in her marriage as well. Philip of Spain, who had never been particularly devoted to his aging English wife, now had even less reason to remain in England. In September 1555, citing urgent matters in the Habsburg territories, Philip departed England. Though he promised to return soon, it was clear to everyone at court, except perhaps Mary herself, that he had little intention of spending more time with his wife than absolutely necessary. Mary was heartbroken by his departure. She had developed a deep, almost obsessive attachment to her husband, decorating her chambers with his portraits and reading his letters repeatedly. Philip, however, viewed their union as purely political, and without the prospect of an heir. England had diminished in strategic importance. He would return only briefly before Mary's death, more out of duty than affection. The contrast between Mary's devotion and Philip's indifference was painfully obvious to the court, adding another layer of humiliation to the Queen's already diminished position. Mary's religious policies were also facing unexpected complications. She had envisioned England's return to Catholicism as a triumphant reunion with Rome, but international politics intervened. Pope Paul V, a stern and uncompromising pontiff, had become entangled in Italian wars against the Habsburg Empire, making him an enemy of Mary's husband Philip. This awkward situation placed Mary in an impossible position, torn between her devotion to the papacy and loyalty to her husband. The Pope's hostility toward Spain meant that England's reconciliation with Rome remained incomplete and fraught with diplomatic complications. Mary's health, never robust, began to deteriorate rapidly under these compounding stresses. By mid-1558, it was widely known throughout the country that the Queen was gravely ill. Her appearances in public became rare, and when she did appear, courtiers noted her pallor and weakness. Mary's judgment, once praised for its clarity, began to falter. She grew increasingly rigid and unable to navigate the complex political challenges facing her realm. As Mary's health declined, the court's attention inevitably shifted toward Elizabeth. This was the natural course in royal politics, as one contemporary observed. People looked to the rising rather than the setting sun. Ambitious courtiers began making discreet journeys to Hatfield, where Elizabeth was residing, hoping to secure favor with the woman who would likely soon wear the crown. Mary, from her sickbed, could only watch as her sister's star ascended while her own Catholic vision for England slipped away. With a growing number of people paying court to her at Hatfield House, Elizabeth Tudor was methodically gathering her supporters around her, preparing for what everyone knew was inevitable. Just 5 years after her triumphant entry into London alongside her sister, Mary died on the 17th of November 1558. She was only 42 years old, her body worn down by illness, grief, and the weight of a tumultuous reign. Elizabeth, at 25, was well prepared for this moment. Working closely with her trusted secretary Robert Cecil, she put her carefully crafted plans into action with remarkable efficiency. The transition of power that followed Mary's death was the most peaceful England had seen in more than a century, a stark contrast to the bloody successions that had characterized the Tudor era until that point. Elizabeth would go on to rule England for the next 45 years, creating one of the most celebrated reigns in English history. Her immediate decisions signaled her independence and political savvy. She rejected the advances of Mary's widower Philip of Spain, making it clear she would not allow England to become a satellite of Spanish power as it had threatened to become under her sister's rule. Years later, when relations with Spain deteriorated completely, Elizabeth would lead England to victory against the Spanish Armada in 1588, cementing her reputation as a defender of the realm and earning the devotion of her subjects. Elizabeth's reign saw unprecedented cultural flowering that would forever change England. As historian Dr. Susan James notes, Elizabeth I's reign saw a kind of printing revolution, a cultural revolution, a revolution in ideas, and a revolution in the way in which ideas are communicated. It was truly the glory age of English literature, producing literary giants whose works continue to resonate centuries later. Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and John Donne all created their masterpieces during her reign, inspired by the atmosphere of relative stability and cultural patronage she fostered. Many historians consider Elizabeth's reign transformative for England. As Tudor scholar Dr. David Starkey emphatically states, she was just the best ruler this country has ever had. There's no question about it. What made Elizabeth's rule particularly remarkable was how she turned what many perceived as a weakness, her unmarried status, into a source of strength. Unlike Mary, who had tied her fate and England's to a foreign prince, Elizabeth refused to marry despite immense pressure. As Dr. Anna Whitelock observes, what Elizabeth doesn't do is marry, and so she fashions a whole different identity over time of an unmarried monarch, which managed to be fashioned or spun in a way that was a sign of strength. The Elizabeth cultivated the image of herself as married to England itself, becoming the symbolic mother of the nation rather than the wife of a king or foreign prince. When examining Elizabeth's leadership style, historians note her commanding presence. When you look at the way that Queen Elizabeth ruled, the absolute authority with which she confronted the problems of her day, you can see that this was the role that she'd been made for, explains Tudor expert Dr. Tracy Borman. Elizabeth understood the power of imagery in a way her sister never fully grasped. Elizabeth glorifies herself by making her own image bigger, brighter, and sheenier than anything that's gone before, notes art historian Dr. Janina Ramirez. While Elizabeth's reign often overshadows Mary's in historical accounts, modern scholarship has begun to reassess Mary's contributions. History often tries to create a clean break between Elizabeth and Mary, portraying them as complete opposites. But the reality is more nuanced. Elizabeth inherited and built upon many of Mary's initiatives. The less glamorous but essential aspects of governance, fiscal reform, naval development, and administrative improvements were all begun under Mary's leadership. As historian Dr. Linda Porter explains, this is all stuff that Mary is beginning. She lays all of the groundwork. Mary's interest in exploration and trade expansion has been particularly overlooked. Mary was very interested in expanding British explorers. She encouraged them to go to Russia and the Baltic. She wanted them to go to America. She was keen on the northern explorations, Northwest Passage, and things like that. Notes maritime historian Dr. Richard Blakemore. Elizabeth took what her sister Mary had started and expanded it dramatically, but the foundations were laid during Mary's brief reign. During her 45-year rule, Elizabeth never married and never had children, a decision that had profound dynastic consequences. The Tudor dynasty, begun by her grandfather Henry VII, ended with her. There would be no more Tudor monarchs. The crown instead passed peacefully to Elizabeth's cousin, the Scottish King James I, who became James I of England. This first Stuart King of England saw to it that the two sisters, the two queens Mary and Elizabeth, were buried together. They lie in a monumental tomb in Westminster Abbey, their remains sharing space in death despite their divisions in life. But the two women, different in so many ways, share more than just a final resting place. Each had been a celebrated heir to the kingdom at some point in their lives. Each had been a child denied by their father through various legal machinations. Each had struggled through a sibling's reign, Mary through Edward's and Elizabeth through Mary's. And most significantly, each had faced the extraordinary challenge of ruling as a woman in a society that fundamentally doubted women's capacity to govern. It was Mary who first articulated the concept of female sovereignty in England. As feminist historian Dr. Sarah Gristwood notes, Mary actually first articulated female sovereignty, who talked about a queen being the mother of the nation, all things that are sort of later attributed to Elizabeth. Even though Mary wasn't ultimately a shining example of successful rule, she had that kind of hard initial work to do in order to convince the people of England that queens weren't a bad thing. Mary's legal innovations were particularly important for Elizabeth's later success. Mary passes a law that says that regnant queens have all the authority of kings. Elizabeth benefits from that. Nobody questions her power and authority because her sister's already been there and established what a regnant queen can and cannot do, explains legal historian Dr. Emma Wells. Together, these Tudor sisters demonstrated that gender need not determine leadership ability. Both of them showed that a woman could do the job just as well as a man, and they were just as clever, and they were just as open to political intrigue and to political deception, observes biographer Alison Ware. Their reigns established crucial precedents for future female monarchs. Without them, you don't get Victoria. You don't get Elizabeth Sepeli. You would always have that idea that a woman would be lesser than a man when it came to the monarchy, notes royal historian Dr. Kate Williams. It can be easy to assume, when we look at the current British monarch, that a queen is commonplace, an unremarkable feature of British governance. But the familiarity of a ruling female monarch can be traced back to the groundwork, which was set nearly 500 years ago by Mary and Elizabeth, two extraordinary sisters who, despite their differences and rivalries, each contributed to reshaping the very concept of monarchy in ways that continue to resonate today.